Greetings, this is Craig Pepin, Project Lead for the Davis Grant. Thank you for listening to this audio recording from the Spring 2024 Competency Fellows Workshop Series. These workshops are funded by a grant from the Davis Educational Foundation, and together with other materials funded by the grant and available on the Competencies website, are designed to help enhance your understanding and learning of Champlain's college competencies. Today's workshop, titled Interdisciplinary Skills for Synthetic Thinking, is led by me. I'm the Integration Fellow. Prefatory note. I actually forgot to start the recording on this meeting and didn't realize it until we were about 20 minutes in. So this is a re-recording, this first part, of the material contained on the first 10 slides and some of the questions that I posed to participants. The recording from the meeting picks up in the middle of a conversation between Mike Lang, Josh Bloomberg, and Bob Mayer, and I'll provide a little bit of context to make sense of where that conversation began when we get there. Okay, welcome to Interdisciplinary Skills for Synthetic Thinking, the integration competency. I start by looking at the definition for integration. It is the ability to move from making simple connections among ideas, disciplines, and experiences to synthesizing and transferring learning and data to new and complex situations. So this is a definition we wrote back in 2014. And over the intervening 10 years, I and others at Champlain have done a significant amount of work in the scholarship of interdisciplinarity to make sense of what this would look like in practice. So I'll talk about that presently, but I want to focus on the synthesis, which is really the key aspect here and one of the most challenging aspects of interdisciplinarity. Moving to the second slide, I also want to draw a distinction between interdisciplinarity and integration. Interdisciplinary, the synthesis of insights from different disciplines or fields of knowledge, is primarily thought of in an academic sense. Integration, according to theorists like Bill Newell, is something that's broader. So it not just includes the kind of synthesis that combines academic experiences, that looking at different disciplines and fields of knowledge, but it also includes non-academic insights, such as stakeholder perspectives or cultural perspectives. So to put another way, if you imagine a Venn diagram, interdisciplinarity would be a subset of integration. So it's wholly contained with integration. But we talk about interdisciplinarity as being particularly relevant in academic settings, whereas integration is a more broad skill. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about integration competency rather than interdisciplinarity at Champlain. We want students to not just have the kind of skill that is appropriate in academic settings, but also the ability to apply those skills in a larger sense when they're outside of academic settings, as many of our students will be in the future. So, next slide talks about why interdisciplinary can be so hard for students and really everyone. Because on the face of it, real life is complex. Real life is integrative in the sense that we are often synthesizing multiple perspectives, sort of different fields of knowledge in order to reach decisions about, like what to do about the problem of pollution in Lake Champlain, which is a big, complex problem that requires a lot of different perspectives in order to make better sense of it or even to make some sort of progress on it. So real life is like that, but formal education, not just in college, but certainly perhaps even more so in our secondary and elementary school systems, is usually characterized by sort of putting knowledge in boxes. Students don't take disciplines, they take subjects, math, social studies, English, physics, chemistry, that sort of thing. And they sort of see them because they're segmented on their class schedule in high school in that way. They're sort of, this is the box in which this goes in. Okay, now the bell has gone off, and now I'm going to go to a different room, literally a different box, and that knowledge I learned in another room, maybe it's German, maybe it's English, whatever, belongs in sort of a separate box. And so we don't often, in our educational system, get to think about the ways in which those boxes connect with each other. There's a second aspect, because formal education is often influenced by the standardized test effect, this notion that there's single right answers. We're forced to choose between perspectives often because we have this color in one of those 5 little dots or however many there are on the test form. And so These two effects sort of lead students to think in terms of content acquisition rather than knowledge production. I go to my chemistry class, I memorize the stuff, I do the flashcards, and then I reproduce it on the test. Chemistry is not so much about making new knowledge. Certainly in high school, it's that way. But it's really about acquiring the content so that I know the thing. And there's value in that, but it definitely has a negative impact on allowing students to sort of see over the boundaries of those subjects or disciplines. I'd also like to talk about certain challenges. So I see sort of two challenges once students are introduced to the idea of interdisciplinary or integrative thinking. And it's sort of two ends of the spectrum. One is that it's so hard. That's a common refrain. And you actually see this in particular among more experienced adults who have gained a lot of specialized knowledge in a particular field. There's a fear of moving beyond what we know or we think we know. I've spent all my time learning what's important in this particular field. I've become an expert in that field. I know that there are other fields out there. I don't want to go beyond where my area of expertise is. This leads to potential inaction. The opposite end of the spectrum, and you see this more with sort of introductory students, is like, it's not so hard. Oh, this is so easy. I'm going to list a bunch of perspectives without thinking about what that means. Okay, yeah, I'm drawing on these different areas, but they don't think about what the implications of drawing on those different areas means for what they're doing. And this tends to lead to superficiality and bad outcomes. So, next slide talks about the two basic steps. And so when we worked on this from a rubric perspective, we tried to translate the language in the definition using our research in interdisciplinarity to make sense of how can we sort of translate this into specific steps for students. We actually ended up, it's pretty straightforward in one sense, two basic steps. And these are the columns from the rubric of the proficient level. So the two basic steps are, first, selecting fields of knowledge or perspectives that are appropriate for the project or the question, and articulating how each field or perspective contributes something different and relevant. So that's first step one. Okay, where do I need to go? What perspectives do I need to draw upon in order to come to a fuller understanding or a better solution to whatever is presented in front of me? And then the second part is actually moving to the synthesis part, and it is combining insights from fields of knowledge and or perspectives to create a cohesive understanding or conceptually integrated product. And it specifically says cohesive understanding and conceptually integrated project for reasons that will become clear presently. So I'll explain that in a little bit. Okay, but first let me begin by focusing on part one, select and evaluate. All right, there's an image here of a car crash. And I love to use this metaphor, or maybe it's an analogy, I don't know. The ways in which different perspectives illuminate different aspects of the subject. So there is a crash. A car runs into another car. There is damage. The drivers get out. And of course, one of the things they want to try to figure out for insurance purposes is who's at fault. Whose insurance company is going to end up footing the bill for this? Something insurance companies also want to know. But each driver is going to have a different perspective. What they were able to perceive based on where they were and what they were doing dramatically influences how they're going to interpret the fault of the crash. So you've got these two drivers. Then let's say you also have a couple of bystanders who happen to witness the crash. They're pedestrians, for example. Maybe one's on a little bit up the street, another one sees it from the side. They are also going to have possibly different interpretations of the crash because they're going to have different angles. So they will see certain things that other perspectives do not see. So this is really, really critical in why we look for integration to begin with, because certain perspectives will give you a certain angle on a subject, in this case, the car crash. It'll give you certain information, but it won't give you a full picture. It will give you some information, but it will also hide other aspects of the subject. So the experience of the pedestrian who's up the street is probably, they're going to see something and have some information, but that information can be different from one of the drivers of the car, for example, most likely, because they'll just have a different perspective on it. And so what the role of the person who is integrating our students is, I like to liken that of the police person who shows up to take an accident report. And so what do? Well, they interview the two drivers. They interview if there are any bystanders who are willing to give witness testimony. They also interview them. And the job of the police officer is to come up with the fullest representation by combining the different perspectives and reaching a judgment on who was at fault. So that's what an integrative investigation aims to do. It combines multiple perspectives, creates a fuller representation of the subject. So I want to take a step back here and focus on the interdisciplinary aspect because, again, that's something we often see here in university settings. And just talk briefly about what is a discipline. So what is a discipline? Or a field of knowledge. So it can be defined epistemologically and institutionally. What do I mean by that? So epistemology means that there's a form of knowledge that is specific to that discipline. And there are rules about that knowledge. But those disciplines, and here and the reason why we don't use the word discipline quite so much at Champlain is because in the wider sphere of higher education, disciplines often have a particular meaning. They refer to the kind of departments that grew sort of to some extent organically and to some extent philosophically in the construction of university systems about 150 to 200 years ago. The modern university, which has a department of mathematics, a department of physics, a department of sociology, and so on and so forth. And those are sort of the traditional disciplines. At Champlain, because we were professionally oriented, a lot of the programs, what students major in, do not necessarily map onto what we call traditional disciplines at, say, UVM or Middlebury. And so we think of them as sort of fields of knowledge. But I am going to argue that, look, those programs count as disciplines as far as Champlain is concerned. So digital forensics and graphic design and social work are bodies of knowledge. They're bodies of knowledge that are specific to those programs. If you are in one of those programs or in your traditional discipline, part of what you get to do is you get to make claim to a privileged knowledge status, which is to say that by dint of gaining a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a PhD in that particular field, that qualifies you to know more and to speak to areas within that field with more authority than someone who has not had that education. So disciplines or fields of knowledge make claims to privileged knowledge. Also, disciplines and fields of knowledge have what we call perspective. So thinking back to the car crash, right? The angle that a social work major would have on a given problem is going to be somewhat different than the angle a digital forensics major may have on the same problem or the same question. So perspectives from a disciplinary or field of knowledge sense are defined by the phenomena that they study. So the phenomena that social work studies is very different from the phenomena that digital forensics studies, for example, right? The methods and rules of evidence. And here's the epistemology part, the knowledge part. What methods do people in those fields use to create new knowledge or to better understand what the issues that they're looking at? What are the rules of evidence? What gets to count as knowledge in that field? So here, looking at traditional discipline like, say, economics, there are certain methods that are specific to economics. And there are also specific rules of evidence for what gets to count as economic knowledge. Often has a lot to do with counting GDP. And I'm going to make the economists mad here by not being able to specifically say exactly what it is that they do. But I'm sure if they were here, they could tell me, yeah, there's ways in which that is economics knowledge. That is economics stuff that matters. We count as, okay, that's new knowledge about some economic theory or how the economy works, or so on and so forth. And we measure it in certain ways, and we have certain methods for measuring that we all agree upon, mostly of us agree upon. And the discipline of economics is partly defined by the phenomena, the methods, and rules of evidence. Another aspect of a disciplinary perspective is the theories and concepts that are specific to that discipline. So whatever those theories and concepts are, and sometimes you can cross over into different disciplines or different fields of knowledge. It's okay for the same theory or concept to be present in multiple fields of knowledge, but they tend to be ones that sort of are roughly in alignment. So say sociology and anthropology, or psychology and behavioral economics, for example. Just take a couple reads. Finally, and this is the hard part, assumptions. Disciplines or fields of knowledge also make certain assumptions. So let me start by talking about the phenomena. I've given some examples here. What is studied? So sociology studies the social nature of societies and human societies within them. It's very different from physics, which is mostly concerned with the nature of matter, subatomic particles, energy, and their interactions. Obviously not the same thing as sociology. We've got a third example of music here. It's not the greatest example, to be honest with you. But what is music? Phenomena, study, development, and production of sound delivered by a particular rate, pattern, and flow. Basically, they've essentially defined what music is there, I think. Then methods and rules of evidence, what gets to count as knowledge. So here again, on this slide, I've got some examples. Physics, theoretical and experimental. Theoretical physics use mathematical modeling. Experimental physicists try to measure and quantify objects and phenomena, often to test the mathematical models of theoretical physics. Sociology also uses a lot of quantitative methods, but they will also use qualitative methods. Those different approaches often have their distinct methods and rules of evidence. What gets to count as quantitative methods, often statistical modeling, for example. Qualitative methods often draws upon more humanities areas like interpretive sciences. So it's worth thinking about, okay, what are the phenomena? What are the methods and rules of evidence? What decides what gets to count as knowledge in my discipline or my field of knowledge or my program? I'd love for you to take a few moments and just think about that for a second. What is it? This is something I asked of the attendees who are here at the workshop, both in person and online. So take a moment and think about that for me. You can pause the recording if you'd like. And then, hope you give some thought to what that is. This is the hard one. Assumptions. The principles often unvoiced that underlie the discipline. This is hard because as specialists, we've sort of internalized the assumptions of our field. For the most part, we rarely take a chance to sort of step back and think about, oh, wait a minute, what are some fundamental assumptions that I have to make in order to practice what my field is? I get a few examples here. Physics. The university works in a law-like manner. And particular phenomena can be understood through general models that can be tested sooner or later. And so they also assume that physicists can transcend cultural experience and beliefs to make definitive measurements about the natural world and natural phenomena. Those are fundamental assumptions that physicists make. I'd say that there is some question as to the degree to which they can transcend cultural experience, at the risk of angering the scientists in the room and related to scientific literacy. But that is an assumption that they make. And that is also fundamental to their source of authority as to why they have access to privileged knowledge when it comes to these matters. There's another assumption I like to toss. It's not on this slide, but economics often has some sort of fundamental assumptions to it. One of the basic assumptions of economics is that human beings are motivated by self-interest, that their goal is to maximize their own self-gain. Now, they've become more sophisticated defining what self-gain is over the years. In order to explain works of charity, for example, rational choice theory, which is rooted in economics, will say that what drives charity or giving, for example, is the good feeling that people get when they give. It's release of endorphins or something like that. And so that ultimately gets translated back into this model of, well, I'm doing it because it makes me feel good, making myself feel good, although I'm reducing the amount of capital that I have, the amount of money that I have. It's worth it in order to feel good about myself. And that is essentially a self-interested reason for doing so. Economists also, for most of the discipline's history, have based on the assumption that human beings will make rational choices about their own self-interest, that they are fundamentally guided by rationality when they decide how to maximize their own self-gain, however they define self-gain. That's become a bit more complicated recently with the rise of behavioral economics. I'm a big fan of Daniel Kahneman, for example, who with Amos Tversky, his partner, tried to look at all of the sort of judgment models that get in the way of people making the most rational choice when it comes to certain decisions. And behavioral economics is sort of moving slightly in the direction of psychology, if you ask me. But it's still based on, okay, we still assume that people, if they are able to overcome things like confirmation bias, they will still make rational choices about what is in their own self-interest. And that's really fundamental to economics. At this point, I asked some of the participants to talk about maybe could they think about one of the assumptions in their fields. I'll give you another example. Val Esposito in sustainability studies. We talked a little bit about some of the assumptions underlying sustainability studies. And again, it's hard to do because the assumptions of our discipline are like the water that we swim in, that the fish swim in. We do not see the water. We do not understand the waters around us. It's just sort of there. And so often understanding these assumptions is best done by with help from people who are outsiders. So just take sustainability studies, a couple of the assumptions that we came up with together. One is that it assumes a holistic understanding of nature. It assumes that you cannot sort of segment off the different parts, as many branches of the natural sciences concerned with environmental issues often will. Chemistry, geology, biology, they have a particular angle. And so to some extent, sustainability studies has an integrative component to it because it seeks to integrate insights from those different natural science disciplines to understand environment in a very holistic way. The other assumption I would suggest is that sustainability studies automatically assumes that preserving the natural environment is a good thing and should be the main goal of humanity. That is not an assumption that is shared universally. And it's the kind of thing we could argue about. But certainly in sustainability studies, for the most part, and I think Val seemed to agree with this, the argument is that, we're looking at sustainability studies because we want to preserve to the greatest extent possible the existing natural environment. So this is the point where the recording picks up. And Bob and Mike were having a discussion about which groups might have the harder time questioning the assumptions of their field of knowledge. And so I will let Bob and Mike take it away from there. And I hope that gives you enough context to understand where they were going with that conversation.
Start with you. Go ahead, Mike. What do you think?
Okay, this is in response to Bob, what you were just saying. I think the split there is not so much between certain kinds of fields and certain kinds of other fields, but how they're sort of understood at Champlain. It's not the difference between an applied field and a more kind of abstract field. It's the difference between a practitioner and an educator.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair, not fair assumption, but there is a category of difference that, maybe that's a better way of framing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that. Well,
yeah, Josh.
Like, you mean between a practitioner and an academic, or do you mean between a practitioner and an educator?
I mean between a practitioner and an educator.
That's where I might have some disagreement, because I think that we have a different disagreements on what do we mean by education, but
yeah.
I think it does point out the complexity of the categorization.
Yeah.
The one thing that you may deal with this separately in the presentation, so I don't need to step on it. But I think a common assumption in any field is that field's important, right? And it's fundamentally really important, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it doesn't matter whether it's a practitioner or academic field, you tend to apply that lens to each situation, and it's hard to shift out of that lens. I do think the practitioner lens tends to be wider than the academic lens, because you're forced, if you're trying to put out a product for people, to support people, you have the business side of things, you have the intellectual side, you have the understanding your users, right? Like there's more aspects that touch across different fields than an academic, which tends to dive deep into a lens.
I think that's true, and I think in some cases, in many cases, but also I think the flip side of that is there are many questions that from the more academic traditional discipline arena that might be asked that aren't even considered on the practitioner side because it doesn't fall within the sort of narrow client response
of production
model. And so again, these aren't about value judgments, they're about trying to discern the differences because they're both approaches are valuable in different ways. But you ask somebody in some of our more practitioner oriented fields some of the questions that we might ask in the more traditional academic fields, and they just kind of go by each other, and vice versa, because they're expecting different things out of that integration. You're expecting different sort of, you're solving different problems in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. If I give you a preview, I would argue that practitioners are more solution oriented and academics are more understanding oriented.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's broadly.
It's a very broad label. All right. I would love to have more conversations like this. I do feel an obligation to sort of present some sort of practical teaching tips down the road. So let me talk about, so up to this point, we talked about disciplines, right? But thinking back to that, interdisciplinary is a subset of integration also including experiences and stakeholder perspectives, right? When we think about integration at Champlain, we've defined it in such a way that also includes sort of non-academic experiences and perspectives that can be incorporated into the interdisciplinary research process. And I'm going to give you an example of that in just a moment. So I'm going to, part two is actually more about the interdisciplinary research process itself, which is a process that we ask students to engage in. And this is true whether they're practitioners or educators, or rather, because at a college, everything is somehow related to education in some way, shape, or form. And what I think we're really trying to train our students to do is sort of think before acting often.
Intentionality and having the vocabulary to understand what they're doing. Because we do the same sort of thing in many of our grade grads. We don't always identify what we're doing.
Exactly. So let me sort of step through the interdisciplinary research process. Identify a problem. This is something typically students would do. Identify a problem or a topic, something they want to know more about, or a solution they want to get a solution for, right? First question they have to ask themselves, is it sufficiently complex to merit an interdisciplinary approach? Because there are plenty of topics and questions that are not, right? But you want to ask yourself first, like, okay, is this complex enough? Questions that demand an integrative approach often are more complex topics, right? Then you want to identify relevant disciplines or fields of knowledge or perspectives. And think about, okay, are there particular insights that a field of knowledge can give us on this area, whatever it is? And, or are there specific methods that are going to help me investigate whatever this thing is, or help me solve whatever this problem is, right? Get answers or get information I need to make a more to make a better, more evidence-driven response. And so this is one of the ways in which we sort of, interdisciplinarians talk about the way they overcome that fear that I was talking about at the beginning. It was like, oh man, I've got this highly specialized knowledge, but I don't want to go outside my own field. I'm safe in my own field, right? Because that's where I have my base of expertise. One of the ways to overcome that is like, and one of the frequent critiques of integration is interdisciplinary is like, well, you can't really truly be interdisciplinary unless you have like PhDs in multiple fields. It's like super unrealistic. And so we like to say is like, all right, well, you don't have to be that deeply engrossed in multiple fields in order to be able to bring them together. Because what we're looking for is insights, not mastery, right? Oh, because she has multiple PhDs, yes. I mean, in Germany, you get multiple PhDs, you get to be called doctor twice. So if you have multiple PhDs, it's hair, they insist that you call them hair doctor. So there are places where that's done. Yes. I never met anybody in Germany who actually had that sobriquet, but I've read about it. So, right. So here's some example, right? It does require becoming conversant in the discipline. And what that means is understanding the disciplinary perspective. What are the phenomena they study? What are some of the methods they use? What are some of the assumptions that they use, right? Yeah, exactly. Partly that's good description for what it means to become sort of conversant. And so I have an example here. I wish more people were better at statistics, because I think it's a really, really valuable skill in today's world, right? But from a quantitative literacy approach, and by the way, Melanie Brown is going to be presenting on quantitative literacy this Thursday, so I definitely recommend you, if you've got time and the inclination to find out what that means at Champlain, come talk to her about it. One of the aspects of quantitative literacy at Champlain is like just know enough to know if the statistics can be trusted if they're being used properly. And that requires a little bit of basic knowledge about numeracy and statistics, but it does not require you to have the detailed technical knowledge in the field of statistics, right? And along with that, we want to say, okay, what can statistical evidence tell us? And what can it not tell us? So what kind of a perspective, what kind of angle does it give us on our subject? And what other angles, what is left out by that perspective, that unique perspective? And where should we go to find different perspectives? Perhaps it's a different methodological approach. Perhaps it's a different field of knowledge, right? Perhaps a different mode of analysis, right? That allow us to sort of come at the angle from multiple approaches, to be the police officer, right? Who gathers the different perspectives and sort of brings it together. Then what we ask students to do when they're engaging in this interdisciplinary process, and these are things you can apply in the classroom, map those different insights. So you get an insight from, let's say, anthropology, and you got an insight from statistics on a particular subject. And we'll show this in a second, right? See ways in which they overlap with each other. See ways in which they illuminate the subject in different ways. Look for areas where they might, in fact, conflict. If you can reconcile the conflicts, that's part of what leads to synthesis. And here, I want to give you sort of an example. So this is back to the participation part. So I like to give this to students, but it's a really effective exercise. Okay, cyanobacteria in Lake Champlain. If you go down the beach in summer, sometimes the beach is closed. It sucks. Val, this is right up your alley, so we might be relying on you a little bit. But I want you to think, and I want it to be a collective effort. I'm not going to write this down on the board, but I want it as a collective effort. What kind of disciplinary perspectives would be relevant to addressing or better understanding the problem of cyanobacteria in Lake Champlain? This is the part where you talk. Yeah, Ryan, what do you think?
I mean, biology, one.
Biology, yep.
Possibly weather science.
Mm-hmm. Climatology. All right.
Climatology, right? Localized weather.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Probably the systems that the city uses or built on, depending on how exactly the cyanobacteria arrives in Lake Champlain, or the factors that are making it appear. So what kind of water are we dumping in there, or chemicals or whatever?
Yeah.
But possibly like a city planning kind of angle if we're talking about how we understand it or can address it.
Mm-hmm. So some knowledge of infrastructure. Val, I'm going to look at you. Where does cyanobacteria come from?
Well, I have a couple more perspectives. It comes from runoff, right? So definitely farmers and how they're interfacing with the land, as well as all of the property owners, city dwellers, anyone who water ultimately ends up in Lake Champlain, which is most of us. That they would certainly be stakeholders in this as well. Do you want me to keep going, or I don't know if I could talk?
Talk about some perspectives. What perspectives are you thinking of?
What do you mean? Like what other disciplinary
perspectives? Yeah.
perspectives? Policy for sure.
Policy.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
In business, you talked about farmers.
Business.
Sociology.
Mm-hmm.
History too, for the historical land use, culture too.
Oh, Bob, historians are important on this.
Yeah.
You should know better.
Cultural practice of farming.
Cultural practice, so maybe some anthropology. We got to get Mike in here, right? Mm-hmm.
Also, that's the fish.
So that's a pretty good list. I mean, we came up with, by my rough estimate, about 7 or 8 different disciplinary perspectives, right? Plus a few stakeholder perspectives, right? So we could do the assumption game, I think, and we've already done it for some of those perspectives already, right? But you right away see it's like, all right, well, they're going to illuminate different aspects of the process. Biology, climatology, meteorology, or whatever. They're going to tell us about the scientific or the natural science parts of it. But that's not enough if you actually want to do something about it. So you're going to need the policy aspects, right? You're going to need the economics approach, as Ryan was saying, right? Because you have to think about what are the economics of making changes in farming practices, in sewage treatment, and whatever else is sort of influencing the cyanobacteria, right?
The longitudinal approach for like the historical vision in all of those disciplines to see, is this a problem that's new? Is this something that happens now that's happened before?
Good. Bob continues to make the case for history, everybody. So, history is the one discipline that rule them all, and in the darkness bind them, as Bob and I both know. But you can right away see how complex it gets, and how, if you want to think about, you need to take into account both, okay, what is the effect of reduced fertilizer runoff from farms actually going to be? How much would we need? You need a scientific perspective to get there, right? But you also need the economics and the policy perspective to figure out how you're going to make that happen. How far can you go before farming doesn't become viable economically anymore?
That's a cultural thing too. Because
exactly.
How much can you actually convince people to do, regardless of what the science tells you?
Yeah. Or also, channeling Mike here, how important is farming culturally to the identity of people in Vermont?
Particular types of farming in particular ways, in particular places.
Exactly. Right. So it gets very, very complex very, very quickly. Right. But to do that, to successful, you're going to have to take those different perspectives into account. All right, synthesis and integration. So synthesis, I like the metaphor of a smoothie as opposed to like a fruit salad. Fruit salad, you're putting in a bunch of different things, but they're still retaining their own sort of distinct shape and form, right? Ideally, you might get to all the way on the outer edge of interdisciplinarity. You're going to a place where they're going to be sort of blended together. But here, and you see that first quote from Alan Repko right there, here's where it gets messy. Even within the field of interdisciplinary studies and the theory, there's disagreement about what exactly is integration, what is exactly is the result of integration. But they have come up with a couple of different types of integration that I think are particularly relevant to Champlain and are things that we can ask our students to strive for. And if they have these concepts, there are things that they can work with and they can be more intentional in what they get. So here's where I talk about sort of the different types of integration. Again, Alan Repko is a guy who's really a leading theorist in this field. He likes to talk about 3 different types. We're going to leave the third type out because that's sort of less relevant to Champlain, but know that conceptual integration exists. It's the kind of things often done in the natural sciences, where they have to sort of bring different theories from different fields into harmony with each other. I think for our purpose at Champlain, contextual integration and problem-solving integration are the ones that are most relevant. So contextual integration, that's most common in the humanities and social sciences. That's situating a given kind of question or topic within its broader context. The goal there is to seek a greater understanding of something. I need to better understand X, whatever X is. And if X is complex, I probably am going to need to call upon multiple fields of knowledge to get a better understanding of X. Closing down the impact of nuclear power is an example that one student did back in the day. I better understand the Harlem Renaissance, right? Those kinds of questions, they tend to be more core type questions. Although I would argue that even in the programs, contextual understanding can be and often is really, really important.
Is there a hierarchy here, or
No.
for instance, do you need to have contextual approaches before you can have problem-solving approaches, or are they all sort of independent?
I would argue that they're independent from each other, right? You can have one without the other. Ideally, you'd have both, right? And so I'll talk about problem solving. And again, this is most common in the programs, right? Where you're looking at a number of different tools and different perspectives in order to address a real world question or a problem. I think one of my favorite examples, and this came up many, many years ago, is a capstone project for a student in one of the ITS programs. I can't remember which one. And he wanted to design a infrared camera tool that could be used by firefighters that could then wirelessly transmit back to a base so that whoever was helping the firefighters coordinate their efforts could get a better sense of what was going on. And so he wanted to build a piece of hardware. And then he also had to apply certain programming principles and networking principles in order to make this work. So he's drawing on a bunch of different fields within information technology, right? All that I would argue are distinct fields of knowledge, right? In order to make this one thing. That's a great example of sort of a problem-solving integration. I think you would arguably film is another great example of where if you're making a film, right, there's a number of different fields number of different areas of expertise within film. Sound, there's color theory, there's, acting, right? Writing in terms of scripting, right? There's a number of different areas that are themselves sort of specialized. Game design, obviously, is also another good example of sort of a game itself is a solution and is a product of integration of these sort of multiple fields. I think the game studio does a great job of doing it.
What problem you're actually solving, the actual implementation and deployment of the solution is going to depend upon how well the contextual integration, contextual understanding. I mean, it will be like rolling out the firefighter camera in the context of privacy expectations.
Exactly.
So, they are independent, they can proceed independently, but in reality, the actual application, but at least certainly in a solution-oriented environment, is going to require, at the very least, contextual integration, and most likely would benefit some sort of conceptual integration from the outset.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me is you can have like a tightly woven integration, and sometimes it's helpful to not tightly weave. So like from problem solving, you have a potential solution to a problem, and then you want to say, well, is it going to work? It's actually helpful to keep the lenses separate and say, well, from this perspective, let's analyze it from this perspective. And you're not tightly weaving it. Whereas in some of the others, you're tightly weaving it in order to solve the problem.
But both approaches require you to understand the three approaches. What you do with them, of course, is what is determined by your goals.
So I think the both that you're talking about, Bob, is absolutely correct. And that's ideally our Champlain graduates, right? We are a professional school. We're practically oriented, but we don't want to turn out people who are not able to take in the context that surrounds whatever thing they're working on, right? And so that's why the core and the programs, ideally, when it's working, you get students in their capstones in their programs, and they're applying core principles to ask those questions about privacy, about ethics, about copyright infringement, about understanding your audience.
Essentially, these are just the educational principles, not core principles or program principles. Principles of education and learning and knowledge creation.
Right. So ideally, you've got senior capstone students who are doing that. I know that in practice, it doesn't always work out that way. And my favorite example, and I know Mike and Bob have heard this before, the game about the Holocaust. This is about 12 years ago, and Amanda told us this great story about this senior game design program They want a first person. The player was going to play as a young girl in German occupied Poland who wakes up and her family is gone.
Remember that.
And she's Jewish. And she has to explore her environment and sort of pick up from these clues. And so you can correct me on the details, Bob, but I remember they had a cell phone present in the room.
There were a lot of issues contextual.
There were the names of the relatives were not Jewish. All these different things, that if you're setting a game in 1941 Poland, you would expect it to do just some basic contextual exploration. And Amanda was sort of rolled her eyes. And so, do you remember some of the other examples, Bob, of this?
There have been numerous.
Yeah.
But not all of this.
Of this particular example, I was wondering.
No, that was more failure, more than just a failure of integration.
Right.
A failure across the broad spectrum of things, but mostly involved with not doing the work necessary to
contextualization.
Contextualization. And to identify the types of problems that you're actually trying to work on. Because you can clear problems you're working with, you can't draw out other disciplines or perspectives to solve it because we don't know how you do it.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the conceptual aspect of not understanding the broader conceptual frameworks.
Exactly. So my argument has always been they've got to be able to do both, essentially.
Sounds like a good learning moment for them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, ideally we'd get them before they were second semester seniors, but
First semester.
First semester seniors, right. So to talk a little bit about contextual integration, finding common ground. So this is pretty typical. You enhance your understanding of a topic or a question. And this is from Mencken and Keystra, which is a textbook we've used in the core 202 for years, with varying success, to be honest. You can add concepts from different disciplines. If you look at a term that's used differently across different disciplines, you can sort of expand the definition, clarify or redefine it. You can show relationships between different disciplinary insights. You can use one discipline as sort of a check and balance on the other. The net result is what you end up with frequently when it's done well is what I call multi-causal explanations, where it's not a monocausal explanation, but sort of multi-causal explanations that's sort of more layered, if that makes sense.
Is that blame Canada?
Oh, that's a good one. We could blame Canada for cyanobacteria, I suppose. And so problem-solving integration, we talked about this all. It's oriented as product development. It is often more policy-oriented, so it's more relevant to Val's field. It's sort of find this sort of more, we want to solve the problem of cyanobacteria in Lake Champlain, right? So I'm sort of skipping ahead because I'm looking at the time, and I want to talk about sort of specific things that you can do in your classes. And so it gets down to the fundamental nature that we cannot be experts in all the fields that our students might draw upon. But we can ask them to engage in the process. And we can ask them to keep track of the process they use to identify relevant disciplines, fields of knowledge, and stakeholder perspectives or cultural perspectives, right? To evaluate those different things and then explain why they're including some perspectives and not others, right? And that does not require us to be experts in a dozen different fields. Because then we can see them engaging in the process. And so that means, and there's a lot of other competencies like this too, documenting the process is really, really critical to both teaching integration, making them conscious of the choices they're making, and allowing us to see it and therefore assess it. So going back to what I said earlier, you first got to determine if a question demands an integrative response, and some don't. But the ones that do are big, and that means the assignments that demand integrative thinking should be big too, right? We're not talking, not so much one-offs. I mean, the example with cyanobacteria I often use as a sort of a classroom activity to sort of get them to think about how a complex problem can demand different perspectives. If they were actually going to explore that, right, and Val, I'm sure they've even done this in your classes, may have done this in your classes. That's like a semester-long project if they're going to do it reasonably well. And so when you are thinking about teaching integrative thinking, you should think about using it with assignments that demand an integrative approach. And that means a scaffolded or multi-step approach is going to be preferential. Otherwise, they'll just go to ChatGPT and give you a 20-page research paper at the end. It came out of nowhere. Right? There's other reasons to use a scaffolded multi-step, and it's not like this is something brand new in pedagogy. Also, again, because you want them to sort of account for the process, you want there to be reflective components in it, where you're specifically asking them, okay, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Right? So there should be a reflective component in there. So scaffolding, most of you are probably familiar with the principle of scaffolding. There are multiple checkpoints within a larger project. If you work in if you're familiar with like Scrum or Agile technology, right, there's sprints, right? And sprints are a great example of things that are scaffolded, right? Every 2 weeks, we're going to check in, right? Or every week or whatever it is, right? We're going to see where we are. We're going to hopefully take a look at our processes too, right? You get these sort of formative feedback loops. Okay, this is not working. Let's think of something else, right? So here's some sample steps in an interdisciplinary research process. Identify the question and conversation, whatever it is, or the problem that you want to address, right? Have them do that first, right? Then have an assignment or multiple assignments where you're asking them to, okay, what perspectives or disciplines are you going to look at? Which ones are you going to look at and why? Which ones did you discard? And have them report on that, right? Then later on, you want them to sort of, all right, what are the connections? What are the insights that you're drawing? What are the conflicts between them? Can they be reconcilable? What are the different perspectives that they're bringing to this thing? And then the final step, which is the product itself, either an enhanced understanding or a conceptually integrated product of some kind, right? Okay, now we've got a response. It's recursive and iterative. Sometimes you go back, sometimes you go forward, but capturing these different steps of the process, right, is what's really, really important if you're going to be teaching integration. I like how John Dewey refers to reflection as intelligent action. And so reflective practice is sort of the intentional and conscious application of skills. And what does it look like in practice? City Brandenburg does a great job with this in a degree design lab, project design lab, where she has a whole series of prompts. And we're going to make these available to anybody who's interested. They'll be in the resources that we're building over the summer for people who want to see those resources. So that you can see like specific real world prompts. This is what I'm using in a project design lab, which is completely open. The project the students come can be anything at all, right? But she asks questions that reveals the choices made. It's great in that it really encourages student agent, allows them to see, oh, I am making choices in where this project goes in the path that I choose to explore. And it's really important that it happens during. Right? Not something where they go back at the end. It's like, oh yeah, here are the choices I made. We don't want it in the past tense. We want it in the present tense. Here are the choices I'm making. It can be a research journal, a developmental blog, which they use in the studio game design, right? It can be a process book in graphic design. There's a lot of different forms that it can take.
Well, the sprints in Agile oftentimes stories, the user stories are good ways of tracking in the moment choices.
Yeah. And here's some examples of sort of standalone assignment prompts or classroom activities that you could do, right? There's sort of, it could be parts along the way of a larger process, or they could be just exercises that you would do in a class to sort of prime the pump for this kind of interdisciplinary integrative investigation, right? And these are all prompts of people. All right. Thanks, Ryan. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye.
So there's another approach. So you have these sort of individual research projects where the individual researcher, the individual investigator, the individual product developer has to think about the multiple fields in which they take. But another approach, and this is sometimes embodied in what I think are the best versions of Core 202, are interdisciplinary group projects, right? And again, Game Studio is a perfect example of this, right?
In theory.
In theory, when it works, right? So if you're designing this in, say, a core class or in another class, right? Team members should come from different disciplines or programs. You want to have the group itself help move towards interdisciplinarity by having them drawn from sort of different fields, right? And this is also part of the degree design lab, the project design lab class, where what's the project we're doing? What's the range of skills and areas of expertise and interest that students have? Let's creatively bring groups together so that we have sort of overlapping, hopefully complementary, but different areas of expertise that they can sort of draw upon, right? I had a slide which I dropped from this presentation called the traits of interdisciplinarity. That slide needs to be fixed. But if you're willing to go outside your home discipline, your home area of expertise, if you overcome that fear, it requires a degree of intellectual humility. It requires a degree of openness, tolerance of ambiguity. And so that's one of the things that you want to emphasize with these sort of group projects, right? Know that you have a particular perspective. Other people have different perspectives. And the goal of the group projects is to bring those perspectives together and see what results from the combining of those perspectives and not have your perspective be dominant, right? So the strong overlay, so this, collaboration competency, you see it in capstones. This is going to circle back to what I said earlier. The fear that we may have of not being expert in all these different fields, right? If you focus on the process, if you have students explain their choices, that allows you to make judgments about the work, about the process that they followed, about whether they're truly being integratively, even without deep expertise. Kind of at 10:58, but I'm curious to know if anybody wants to sort of suggest any other assignments or classroom activities that would sort of promote integrative thinking skills. And did you see anything here like, oh yeah, that's something I could do in my class?
I was thinking ground interrogation in some ways of a project or idea. So you frame and there's the build stage where you need to look at it from different perspectives and design it from those different perspectives. But then before you get all the way through that build phase, you need to kind of interrogate, okay, from this angle, does it meet the need? From this angle, does it meet the need? And there's a couple ways you can do that, which is kind of cool, but that could be other people in the class who are in different disciplines, right? Looking at yours. It could be asking a ChatGPT, play the perspective of this person, and the student teaches ChatGPT what it's doing and what the project is and why it's doing it, and it just asks questions from that perspective to stimulate it. So I think that's an interesting second phase after the early design.
You can adopt that, I think, even earlier in the process in the sense of having a discussion from different perspectives on what, in fact, is the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yep.
What is this even a problem? Because from different perspectives, it may or may not be. For me, the biggest challenge is getting students to ask those questions, to start with the assumption that their perspectives determine the way they approach these things, that they are, in fact, making choices, because the default oftentimes tends to be that the problem exists and that there obviously is a solution that needs to exist without going through the steps of saying, how do you get there? Why is this even a problem? What are the factors that make you think this is a problem? Then how would that be different from a different perspective before you even start going through it? Otherwise, going through the motion, and everybody just runs with an assumption that seems to be common. It's easier, as you said, if you have people from different perspectives in your group. Sometimes in class it's difficult when you get 12 students with the same major, but I think that helps right here. You may ask those questions from the very beginning to understand that there are in fact perspectives and they're important.
The way that you frame the question And the way that you choose a question also involves certain assumptions.
Yeah, I think some of the stuff just talking to different stages. Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to ask that even super early in the process. Yeah.
And throughout, I like that too. Some people obviously continuously interrogate.
Thanks, Ryan. Val, Mike, any ideas before we sign off? I need to gather material for the website, so I'm looking for other people to chime in with ideas about how it is. I love the idea of using AI to represent a different perspective. I'd be very curious to see how that works in practice.
Definitely.
Okay, that'd be really cool.
Technically, that didn't work.
Excuse me.
I don't know that I've got a lot useful here because I approach everything so theoretically that the application part is outside the realm of what I teach and how I teach. So the integration that I teach is entirely epistemological according to Repco.
But it has the same some of the same challenges getting students to understand the concept of perspectives, I imagine, and the value of those perspectives and the significance.
Probably, but honestly, I don't really engage those because the theories are so foreign to the students.
Gotcha.
And the teaching them to think theoretically is so
All the bandwidth.
foreign to them that getting into the kind of that nitty gritty isn't really, it's not available because they need to get so far just to be able to do it.
Do you have any challenges getting them to understand what the hell you mean when you're talking about theories, that they are these collections of sort of, these epistemological approaches, that there are different ways of looking at things? Because I find sometimes that their assumption that it's working against an assumption of universality.
Yeah, well, that comes from the pedagogy. By structuring it through ethnographic lenses and then having a theory be the result of a thing they talk about, they don't know what they're talking about, but they bump into a theory and then I just identify it, then it doesn't have the same kind of foreignness.
All right, so you make it more organic for that.
I didn't hear what he said.
You say make it more organic through their own efforts, in a sense.
Exactly, yeah. And so then it just becomes, in their minds, it just becomes a name for a thing that they already know. I mean, it's more than that, but that's,
yeah.
By approaching it that way, it removes the foreignness, so you don't end up with any of the resistance.
Yeah. But at the same time, you've also taught the capstone graphic design with Suzanne. Time. And I think Suzanne has sort of bought into your approach in a sense that she sees a distinction between the contextual research and the application of the research to the project. And she structures her graphic design capstone very much in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair enough. I was thinking in my core courses, but in capstone it is. Well, I teach the theoretical thinking in the same way, and then we just hammer them at the end with. You have to explain this to me. You have to explain how and why that thinking is present in your design choices.
Yeah, and they have to translate, but you ask them to do some of the theoretical research. But then they have to translate it into a practical application, which is a graphic design project of some kind.
But that part is built into the field of graphic design already. Graphic design already researches audience and knows that they need to sort of act as translator. They don't sort of talk about it in those terms. What I'm injecting is the theoretical thinking and integrating that into their process of researching audience and the content of what they're designing.
Right. I think I've always struggled. One thing I've struggled with the rubric is that it has so I showed you the first two lines of the rubric. There's a third category, which is application, applying the results of the research to a product, which is certainly relevant in a lot of Champlain, but oftentimes in the core, they don't get to that stage, right? So in the core, the synthesis is the product. Right, the enhanced contextualized understanding is the product itself, right? And so, if students in the degree design lab, for example, when they're building their portfolios of evidence, right, they'll often use something they did in the core, something they did for us, right? I'm like, okay, well, that third criteria doesn't apply in this case, and that's okay, right? But if they bring in something from their particular program, right, that is more solution oriented, then I was like, okay, let's see the research that you did and how is it applied to the product, and then application does come into play. But it's always been I've always been on the fence about that particular criteria. So I see how it is relevance in some situations, but it's not relevant in all situations.
Well, I think that's true for a lot of our college competencies that we only end up teaching some of the criteria within a course or in a context. I think that's fine. The thing with ambiguity, you said something at the very beginning, which I'm trying to reframe, but I think is really important here for students to understand, is we have students who come to Champlain knowing what they want to do for the most part. And that means they tend to already have a pretty tight lens within that discipline or program or worldview. And so I think it's particularly a bit of a challenge for us to say, well, step back, look beyond that lens.
Very much
right? And then if we're to communicate to students, it's not the thing that will help you get a job. It's the thing that will help you get a promotion. Because you can get, like, it's great to have a niche person who's the engineer, right? In their field, but if they don't understand the bigger picture, right, they're not going to be able to move up.
Unless they're a COBOL programmer, in which case they're set for life.
Well, they don't have to move up. They can stay at
They get paid 6 figures for maintaining each megabit.
Oh, that's my son's interested in that, actually.
That was good.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
If you're interested in the sort of the history of disciplinarity from a particular, and I consider you all pretty intellectually inclined in that respect, I'm going to PDF this chapter out of this book that talks about the rise of disciplines and professionalization and anxiety. It's pretty fascinating. And maybe we can get together for coffee and talk about it once in May or something like that. Anyways, thanks, Bob. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Josh, for sticking around.
Thanks, Greg.
And I'll see you guys later.